He should have died 10 minutes ago. The thought didn't belong to anyone in the room, yet somehow it lingered in the air, quiet and invisible, like the woman no one noticed standing just a few feet away from the most powerful man in the city. Emma Carter kept her eyes down as she approached table 7, balancing a polished silver tray with 2 glasses of Bordeaux that cost more than her monthly rent, the soft glow of candlelight reflecting off crystal and gold accents that made everything feel unreal, like a stage where everyone had a role except her. The restaurant stretched wide across nearly 5,000 square feet, filled with low conversations, tailored suits, and the kind of laughter that came from people who had never once worried about missing a payment, and at the center of it all sat Dante Romano, still, composed, his presence heavier than the dark marble columns around him, the kind of man who didn't need to speak to command attention. Across from him, Isabella Laurent smiled with effortless perfection, her hand resting lightly on his wrist, her engagement ring catching the light every time she moved, a flawless image that anyone else would have admired without question. But Emma didn't admire it. She couldn't. Not after what she had seen. Her fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the tray as she slowed her steps, her heartbeat beginning to echo in her ears, because there it was again, just beneath the delicate lace of Isabella's sleeve, the faintest glimpse of a symbol that didn't belong in a place like this, 3 small stars aligned beside a thin blade, subtle enough to be dismissed by anyone who didn't know better, but Emma knew better. She had spent months trying to forget that mark, trying to bury the memory of a late-night phone call, a voice shaking on the other end, her brother whispering about something he wasn't supposed to see, something that would get him killed if he didn't disappear, and then silence that lasted forever. The tray trembled almost imperceptibly as Emma reached the table, placing the glasses down with practiced precision, her movements smooth, controlled, invisible, just another server passing through a world that was never meant to notice her, but her mind refused to stay quiet, because Isabella wasn't just another wealthy fiancée, and tonight wasn't just another dinner. There was a pattern here, the way Isabella checked her phone without unlocking it, the subtle nod she gave to a man seated near the bar who didn't seem to belong to any party, the way the room felt just slightly too coordinated, like something was about to happen that everyone except the right people were meant to ignore. Emma stepped back, lowering her gaze again, but this time her eyes flickered upward just long enough to meet Dante's, and for a fraction of a second, time slowed, his expression unreadable, sharp, observant, as if he sensed something beneath the surface, something shifting in the air that no one else could feel, and Emma looked away immediately, her breath catching as she turned, because that single glance made everything more dangerous, more real. She shouldn't get involved. She knew that. People like her survived by staying silent, by moving through spaces without leaving a trace, by pretending not to see the things that didn't concern them, and yet the memory of her brother's voice refused to fade, the urgency, the fear, the unfinished warning that had come too late. Emma moved toward the service station, her steps quick but controlled, her hands already reaching for a small notepad tucked into her apron, the paper thin and ordinary, nothing about it suggesting the weight it was about to carry, and as she picked up a pen, her fingers hesitated for just a second, hovering above the blank page while the noise of the restaurant blurred into something distant and meaningless. Then she wrote, the words forming faster than her thoughts could catch up, each letter pressed just a little too hard into the paper, as if urgency could be transferred through ink, and when she finished, she tore the sheet cleanly, folding it once, small enough to disappear between glass and tablecloth, her pulse steadying in a way that felt almost unnatural, like the moment before a storm breaks. Across the room, Dante Romano lifted his glass, unaware that somewhere between the quiet elegance and the carefully arranged smiles, something had already begun to shift, something that could not be undone once it reached him. Emma folded the paper once more as if that small motion could somehow contain the weight of what she had just decided, then slipped it into the narrow space between her order pad and apron, her breath steady but shallow as she turned back toward the dining room where everything looked exactly the same and yet felt completely different, as if the air itself had shifted by a fraction no one else could measure, the soft hum of conversation continuing without interruption while crystal glasses clinked and silverware brushed against porcelain, a perfect illusion of control that only made the unease in her chest grow sharper, because she knew something no one else at those tables knew, and that knowledge made her dangerous. Across the room, Isabella leaned slightly closer to Dante, her voice low and warm, the kind of tone designed to draw attention without ever seeming to demand it, her fingers tracing a slow, absent circle against his wrist as she spoke, and for anyone watching, it would have looked like affection, like certainty, like the beginning of something permanent, but Emma noticed the details others missed. The way Isabella's eyes flicked briefly toward the entrance every few seconds, not out of nervousness but calculation, the way her posture remained just a little too perfect, like someone holding a position they had rehearsed too many times, and most of all, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes. Emma moved again, this time with intention, her steps quiet as she approached a nearby table, pretending to clear plates that did not need clearing, using the reflection in a polished serving dome to watch without being seen, her pulse ticking faster as she spotted the man near the bar shift his stance ever so slightly, his attention fixed not on his drink but on Dante, his fingers tapping once against the counter before going still, a signal too subtle for most, but Emma had learned to recognize patterns like that, patterns that meant coordination, timing, something planned down to the second. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. Because the realization settled in fully now, heavy and undeniable, this was not suspicion, this was certainty, and certainty demanded action. Her hand brushed against the folded note again, grounding her for a moment, and she forced herself to move, to step out from the safety of observation and back into the open space between tables where every movement could be seen, every hesitation could be questioned, and yet no one looked at her, not really, to them she was still just another waitress, another part of the background designed to serve and disappear. When she reached table 7 again, time seemed to slow in a way that felt almost unreal, the distance between her and Dante shrinking with each step until she could hear the faint shift of his breath, see the fine details in the stitching of his suit, the subtle tension in his jaw that suggested he was never as relaxed as he appeared, and for a split second, doubt tried to creep in, whispering that she could still walk away, still pretend she had seen nothing, still protect herself the way she always had. But then she remembered the silence after her brother's last call, the unanswered questions, the weight of not acting when she could have, and that was enough. Without breaking her rhythm, without drawing attention, Emma reached forward as if adjusting the placement of a glass, her fingers steady now as she slid the folded note beneath the edge of Dante's hand, a movement so small it vanished the moment it was completed, and then she stepped back immediately, her gaze dropping as she turned away, every instinct telling her not to look, not to wait, not to reveal that anything had changed, because in that single second, she had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and somewhere behind her, the man who controlled the room had just been handed a truth that could unravel everything. Dante did not react immediately, and that was the first sign that something had changed, because men like him never rushed, never showed surprise in front of an audience, yet the moment his fingers felt the faint edge of paper beneath his hand, there was a pause so subtle it could have been mistaken for nothing at all, a fraction of a second where his glass hovered just before reaching his lips, where the rhythm of his breathing shifted just enough to break the illusion of ease, and then, without drawing attention, he lowered the glass back to the table, his fingers adjusting slightly as they concealed the folded note from anyone else's view, his expression remaining composed, controlled, untouched by whatever had just entered his world. Isabella continued speaking, unaware or perhaps pretending to be, her voice flowing with practiced warmth as she described something about their future, her words carefully chosen, each sentence polished to perfection, but Dante was no longer listening, not fully, because his focus had narrowed to the small piece of paper beneath his hand, to the weight of it, to the question of why someone would risk placing it there, and more importantly, whether it deserved his attention. He did not open it right away, not because he was hesitant, but because he understood timing, because every movement in a room like this carried meaning, and the wrong one could ripple outward in ways that could not be contained. Instead, he shifted slightly in his chair, leaning back just enough to create the smallest pocket of privacy, his other hand lifting the glass again as a distraction, as a signal to anyone watching that nothing had changed, that everything remained exactly as it should be, and only then, with a movement so controlled it was almost invisible, did he slide the note open beneath the table, his eyes lowering just enough to catch the words written in hurried, pressed ink. For a moment, there was nothing, no visible reaction, no sharp intake of breath, no sudden tension that others could read, but something deeper shifted behind his eyes, something colder, sharper, the kind of awareness that did not panic but calculated, that did not fear but evaluated, and when he looked up again, the room was no longer what it had been a minute ago. It was no longer a celebration, no longer a gathering of allies and future promises. It was a structure of variables, of positions, of intentions hidden beneath appearances, and he began to see them one by one. The man near the bar, too still, too focused, not drinking, not engaging, simply waiting. The subtle delay in the service flow near the entrance, a gap that should not exist in a place this well managed. The way Isabella's phone remained face down but within reach, her fingers brushing against it at intervals too regular to be coincidence. Dante's gaze returned to her, steady now, searching, and for the first time that evening, he truly looked, not at the image she presented but at the details beneath it, the tension in her shoulders masked by elegance, the precision of her movements that suggested rehearsal rather than instinct, and in that moment, something inside him settled into certainty, not emotional, not reactive, but absolute. He folded the note again without looking down, his fingers memorizing its presence before slipping it into the inside pocket of his jacket, a decision made without hesitation, not about belief, but about preparation, because whether the warning was true or not no longer mattered. What mattered was that it existed, that someone had risked delivering it, and that meant the possibility of danger had already entered the room. Across the table, Isabella paused briefly, her eyes narrowing for just a fraction of a second as if sensing a shift she could not yet identify, and Dante met her gaze with the same calm expression he had worn all night, offering nothing, revealing nothing, a silence that felt heavier now, more deliberate, and somewhere behind him, unnoticed by most, Emma Carter had already moved back into the flow of the restaurant, her presence dissolving once again into the background, but the impact of her choice remained, invisible and irreversible, and in that quiet space between knowledge and action, the balance of the evening had begun to tilt in a direction no one else could yet see. The shift was so quiet that no one at the surrounding tables noticed it, yet everything about Dante Romano's presence had changed, not in posture or expression, but in attention, the kind that sharpened the air around him, turning a room full of comfort into a landscape of possibilities, each movement now carrying weight, each glance holding meaning, and across from him, Isabella felt it even if she could not yet define it, her smile lingering a second too long before she tilted her head slightly, studying him with a curiosity she quickly disguised beneath charm. "You seem distracted," she said softly, her tone light, almost teasing, but her eyes searching, measuring, trying to understand what had shifted beneath the surface, and Dante met her gaze with the same calm composure, the same controlled stillness that had made men twice his age hesitate before speaking, offering nothing but a faint, almost imperceptible smile that revealed nothing of the storm now forming behind it. "Just thinking," he replied evenly, his voice steady, unhurried, the kind of answer that closed doors instead of opening them, and for a moment, Isabella held his gaze as if deciding whether to push further, then she relaxed back into her chair, her fingers once again brushing lightly against his sleeve, a gesture that looked affectionate but now felt deliberate, calculated, and Dante noticed that too. Around them, the restaurant continued its performance, waiters moving in precise patterns, conversations rising and falling in waves, but Dante's focus had already moved beyond the table, mapping the room in quiet increments, counting exits, noting distances, tracking the rhythm of movement that no longer felt natural, and then, without turning his head, he made a small gesture with his hand, barely more than a shift of fingers against the table, a signal so subtle it vanished the moment it was made. Yet across the room, one of his men adjusted his stance almost immediately, stepping half an inch closer to the wall, his eyes scanning with new purpose while maintaining the appearance of stillness. Dante reached for his glass again, lifting it slowly, giving himself a reason to pause, to observe, to let the second stretch just enough to confirm what instinct had already told him, that the man near the bar had not moved in over 2 minutes, that the couple near the entrance had exchanged a glance that did not match their conversation, that the timing of everything felt too precise, too aligned, and when he set the glass back down, the decision had already been made, not rushed, not reactive, but final. Across the table, Isabella's phone lit up briefly, a soft glow beneath her hand, and though she did not pick it up, her eyes flickered downward for a fraction of a second before returning to him, a detail so small it would have escaped anyone else, but Dante saw it, catalogued it, and added it to the growing certainty forming in his mind. Somewhere behind him, Emma Carter moved through the dining room with the same quiet efficiency as before, her hands steady now as she cleared a table, her expression neutral, giving no sign of the choice she had made or the consequences that might follow, yet her awareness had not faded, because even from a distance, she could feel the change, the way the atmosphere had tightened, the way something unseen had begun to unfold, and she kept her distance, not out of fear, but out of understanding. That whatever happened next was no longer hers to control. Dante leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting once more across the room before returning to Isabella, his expression composed, almost relaxed, as if nothing at all had shifted, but beneath that surface, every calculation had already been made, every possibility weighed, and in the quiet space between what was known and what was about to happen, he spoke again, his voice calm, measured, carrying just enough authority to sound natural, yet enough intent to begin altering the course of the evening. "Let us step outside for a moment," he said, as if suggesting nothing more than fresh air, nothing more than a brief pause in a perfect night, and for the first time since she had sat down, Isabella hesitated, just for a second, her fingers tightening slightly against the edge of the table before she smiled again, softer this time, less certain, and nodded, unaware that the balance of control had already begun to slip beyond her reach, and that somewhere between a folded piece of paper and a single quiet decision, everything had changed. Dante stood first, the movement smooth and unhurried, chair sliding back just enough to signal intention without drawing attention, and for a moment the world seemed to pause around that single decision, as if the room itself was waiting to see what would follow, while Isabella looked up at him with that same polished expression, her smile returning effortlessly, but something behind it had shifted, something tighter, more alert, as though she could feel the current changing direction even if she did not yet understand why. "Of course," she said, rising gracefully, her hand brushing against the table for balance, her posture perfect, every movement controlled, yet her eyes flickered once toward the entrance, a glance so brief it would have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but Dante saw it, noted it, and confirmed what instinct had already whispered, that timing mattered more to her now than appearances. He offered his arm, a gesture expected in a setting like this, and she accepted it without hesitation, her fingers resting lightly against his sleeve, but there was a difference now, a faint stiffness beneath the elegance, as if she were measuring his movements as carefully as he was measuring hers, both of them walking the same line but for entirely different reasons. Together, they moved through the dining room, passing between tables where conversations continued uninterrupted, where laughter still floated above crystal glasses and soft music played in the background, and yet the path they took felt deliberate, calculated, Dante guiding their pace just slightly slower than necessary, just enough to allow his peripheral vision to capture everything around them. The subtle shift of his man near the wall now aligning closer to the exit, the man at the bar straightening almost imperceptibly as they approached, the couple near the entrance falling silent as they passed, their attention lingering a second too long before turning away. Isabella spoke softly as they walked, something about needing fresh air, about the room feeling warm, her voice steady, natural, but Dante heard the layer beneath it, the urgency disguised as casual observation, the need to maintain control over a situation that was beginning to slip beyond her reach. The doors leading outside stood just ahead, tall glass panels reflecting the interior lights back into the room, creating a barrier that felt both transparent and impenetrable, and as they drew closer, Dante slowed slightly, his hand adjusting against Isabella's as if to guide her, but in reality to pause, to reassess, to confirm that every piece was where it needed to be before the next move was made. Behind them, Emma Carter remained near the service station, her hands occupied with polishing a glass that did not need polishing, her eyes lowered but her awareness fully engaged, because even without looking directly, she could feel the shift intensifying, the quiet tension stretching thinner with every passing second, and she knew that whatever was about to happen would not announce itself with noise or chaos. It would begin with something small, something almost invisible, just like the note she had placed moments ago. Dante reached the door and stopped, just briefly, his reflection staring back at him through the glass, composed, controlled, unchanged to anyone who might be watching, yet beneath that surface every calculation had already aligned, every instinct sharpened to a single point of clarity, and in that pause, Isabella's fingers tightened ever so slightly around his arm, a reaction she could not fully suppress. A signal that told him more than any words could. He turned his head just enough to meet her gaze, his expression calm, unreadable, and for a fraction of a second, neither of them moved, the silence between them heavier than the music behind them, until Dante spoke again, his voice low, steady, carrying no trace of urgency, yet shifting everything with a single sentence. "After you," he said, stepping aside just enough to allow her to move first, a gesture of courtesy on the surface, but in reality a test, a decision point, because in a world built on control, the person who moved first revealed more than they intended, and in that moment, as Isabella hesitated for just a fraction of a second before stepping forward, the truth began to surface, quiet, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. Isabella moved first, just as he had intended, her heels making the faintest sound against the polished floor as she stepped through the doorway into the cool night air, her posture still elegant, still composed, but the hesitation from moments before had not disappeared, it had only been buried beneath habit and control, and Dante followed a step behind, his pace measured, his expression unchanged, yet the moment the door closed behind them, the atmosphere shifted completely, the warmth and noise of the restaurant replaced by a quiet that felt sharper, more honest, as if the outside world had no interest in maintaining illusions. The street stretched out under soft amber lights, a line of luxury cars parked along the curb, their surfaces reflecting the city like polished mirrors, and for a second, everything appeared normal, just another couple stepping outside for air, just another evening continuing as planned, but Dante did not move further, he stopped just beyond the entrance, his gaze lifting slowly to scan the street, not in a hurried way, but with deliberate calm, taking in distances, shadows, reflections, the placement of each vehicle, the rhythm of passing traffic nearly 100 feet away, and most importantly, the spaces where something felt missing, where movement should have existed but did not. Isabella turned slightly toward him, her smile softer now, more controlled, as if she were adjusting to a script that no longer felt entirely secure, and her voice carried a lightness that did not quite reach her eyes. "It is quieter out here," she said, her tone casual, but there was a subtle edge beneath it, a question hidden inside the statement, a need to understand why he had brought her outside at this exact moment. Dante nodded once, slow, almost absent, his attention still scanning, his awareness extending beyond her, beyond the immediate space, because the note had not told him what would happen, it had only told him when, and that meant timing was everything. He shifted his stance slightly, positioning himself just enough to alter their angle relative to the street, his body now blocking a direct line from one side without making it obvious, a movement that looked natural but carried intention, and Isabella noticed that too, her eyes narrowing for just a fraction of a second before she stepped closer, closing the space between them as if to reclaim control, her hand resting lightly against his chest, a gesture that appeared intimate but felt calculated, her gaze searching his face for something she could use, something she could read. "You are being unusually quiet," she said softly, her voice lowering, her expression carefully crafted to draw him back into the version of the evening she had planned, but Dante did not respond immediately, and that silence stretched just long enough to create discomfort, just long enough to reveal the first crack in her certainty. He looked down at her then, not with suspicion, not with anger, but with a calm clarity that carried more weight than either, as if he had already reached a conclusion and was simply observing how the final pieces would fall into place. Behind them, through the glass, the restaurant continued its performance, unaware of the shift that had already occurred, unaware that the balance had moved outside those doors, and somewhere inside, Emma Carter stood still for a moment longer than necessary, her hands resting against the edge of a table, her breath quiet but steady, because even without seeing it, she knew the next moment had arrived, the point where warning turned into consequence. Out on the street, a car door down the block opened and closed with a soft, distant sound, subtle enough to blend into the night, but Dante heard it, catalogued it, and in that instant, everything aligned, not with panic, not with fear, but with precision, the kind that came from understanding exactly when to move and when to remain still. He stepped slightly to the side, his hand lifting just enough to guide Isabella back half a step without force, without explanation, a motion so controlled it felt almost like instinct, and for the first time since the evening began, her composure faltered, just slightly, her eyes flickering with something real, something unguarded, because she realized in that moment that whatever she had planned was no longer unfolding the way it was supposed to, and Dante Romano, calm and unmoved, had already stepped beyond the reach of it. For a brief moment, nothing happened, and that was the most dangerous part, because silence in a moment like this was never empty, it was filled with decisions unfolding just out of sight, with intentions adjusting to a reality that had shifted without warning, and Isabella felt it now, not as a clear understanding, but as a loss of control, a subtle unraveling of something she had believed was perfectly timed. Her hand remained against Dante's chest, but the confidence behind the gesture had weakened, her fingers no longer resting with effortless ease but holding just slightly, as if grounding herself against a balance she could no longer fully predict, and when she looked up at him again, searching, measuring, there was a question in her eyes that had not been there before. Dante did not answer it, not with words, not with expression, because he had already moved past the need to explain, his focus now entirely on the environment around them, the pattern of stillness and motion that had revealed itself piece by piece, the way the street had grown just a fraction too quiet, the way the reflections in the car windows showed shapes that did not belong, lingering longer than they should, shifting in ways that did not match the rhythm of the city. He adjusted his stance again, barely noticeable, positioning himself so that the glass doors behind them remained within his peripheral vision, while the open street stayed directly in front of him, his awareness expanding outward in layers, mapping not just what he could see, but what he could infer, and in that quiet calculation, the final piece fell into place, not as a sudden realization, but as a confirmation of everything he had already begun to understand. Isabella took a small step forward, attempting to draw him back into her space, her voice softer now, almost coaxing, as if trying to regain the narrative she had been controlling all evening. "You are overthinking this," she said gently, though the certainty in her tone had thinned, replaced by something more urgent, more insistent, and for the first time, Dante responded immediately, his voice calm but firm, carrying a clarity that cut through the quiet without raising its volume. "No," he said simply, and the single word landed heavier than anything else that had been spoken that night, because it was not a disagreement, it was a conclusion. Isabella's expression shifted then, just slightly, the polished surface cracking enough to reveal something beneath it, something sharper, less patient, her eyes narrowing as she stepped back half an inch, her gaze flicking past him toward the street, toward the timing she had relied on, and in that brief glance, she confirmed what Dante already knew, that something was supposed to happen, something that had not yet happened, and that delay was enough to change everything. Behind the glass doors, inside the restaurant, one of Dante's men moved subtly closer to the exit, his posture unchanged to anyone else, but his attention now fully aligned with the shift outside, while Emma Carter stood frozen for just a second longer, her breath caught in that fragile space between action and consequence, because even without seeing it, she could feel the moment tipping, the invisible line being crossed. Out on the street, the car door that had closed earlier did not open again, the figures reflected in the windows did not advance as expected, and the rhythm that had been building towards something precise began to fracture, uncertainty replacing coordination, and Dante recognized it immediately, the hesitation of a plan disrupted, the pause of people waiting for a signal that no longer aligned with reality. He stepped forward then, just one step, but it was enough to break the symmetry of the moment, enough to place himself fully outside the pattern that had been set for him, and in doing so, he took control of a situation that had been designed to contain him, his presence no longer passive, no longer reactive, but deliberate, grounded, and completely aware. Isabella watched him closely now, no longer pretending, no longer hiding the tension beneath her composure, because she understood what had happened even if she could not yet undo it, that somewhere between the inside of that restaurant and this quiet stretch of street, something small and unseen had shifted the entire balance of the night, and the man standing in front of her was no longer walking into her plan, he was stepping beyond it. The silence stretched just long enough to expose the truth that neither of them could fully hide anymore, and in that quiet, something shifted irreversibly, not in the world around them, but in the space between them, where illusion had once lived and now could no longer survive. Isabella's composure did not break completely, but it thinned, like glass under pressure, her expression still controlled, still refined, yet no longer convincing, because the certainty she had relied on was gone, replaced by calculation that came a moment too late. She withdrew her hand from his chest slowly, deliberately, as if choosing distance over proximity, her posture straightening, her gaze sharpening, no longer pretending softness, no longer playing the role she had worn so perfectly inside the restaurant. "You should not have stepped outside," she said quietly, her voice losing its warmth, revealing something colder beneath, something precise and measured, and Dante did not respond with surprise, because he had already moved beyond that point, his awareness now settled, grounded in the reality she had just confirmed without realizing it. He watched her for a moment, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a calm understanding that carried more weight than either, because the truth no longer needed to be uncovered, it had already revealed itself in the smallest of details, in the hesitation, in the timing, in the shift of her voice. "You planned everything," he said evenly, not as a question, but as a statement, his tone steady, controlled, the kind of voice that did not seek answers because it already held them, and Isabella held his gaze without flinching, her silence more revealing than any denial could have been. Around them, the street remained still, but it was no longer the stillness of anticipation, it was the stillness of disruption, of something that had failed to align, of people waiting for a moment that had already passed them by, and Dante recognized it immediately, the fracture in coordination, the delay that turned precision into uncertainty. He stepped slightly closer, not in threat, but in clarity, his presence filling the space between them in a way that left no room for pretense, and when he spoke again, his voice carried that same quiet authority, but now with a finality that could not be mistaken. "You expected me to follow your timing," he said, his eyes steady on hers, but something changed. Isabella's jaw tightened just slightly, the only visible crack in her control, and for the first time, she looked past him, toward the street, toward the absence of what should have already happened, and in that glance, she confirmed everything he needed to know, not with words, but with the realization that she was no longer certain of what came next. Behind the glass doors, inside the restaurant, the atmosphere had begun to shift as well, subtle at first, a ripple rather than a wave, as staff moved with slightly more urgency, as conversations dipped and rose again without understanding why, and Emma Carter stood still for just a moment longer, her hands resting against the edge of a table, her eyes lowered but her awareness sharp, because she could feel it now, the turning point, the moment where the unseen became undeniable. Outside, Dante exhaled slowly, not out of relief, but out of recognition, because the situation had already resolved itself in the only way that mattered, he was no longer where he had been expected to be, no longer within the structure that had been designed for him, and that alone was enough to change everything. He stepped back then, creating space between them, not retreating, but redefining the moment, his gaze never leaving hers as the distance grew by just a few inches, enough to signal that whatever connection had existed before was gone, replaced by something colder, something clear. Isabella remained still, her expression composed once more, but different now, stripped of illusion, her eyes no longer searching, but calculating, because she understood the same truth he did, that the night had already shifted beyond recovery, that whatever had been set in motion no longer belonged to her. And in that quiet, under the dim glow of streetlights and the reflection of a world still pretending nothing had changed, the balance settled into a new reality, one where control had moved without announcement, without spectacle, and where the smallest unseen action had rewritten everything. The space between them held for a moment longer, quiet and heavy, until Dante turned without another word, his decision made not through confrontation but through clarity, and began walking back toward the glass doors, leaving Isabella standing beneath the dim streetlights where control had slipped from her grasp without a single raised voice, without a single scene, and that silence carried more consequence than anything louder ever could. He did not look back at her, not because he dismissed her, but because he no longer needed to measure her, the truth had already been revealed in the smallest details, and in his world, that was enough. Behind the glass, the restaurant continued its careful performance, but something had already begun to shift, subtle at first, like a ripple moving beneath the surface, as Dante stepped inside, the warmth and sound returning around him, yet no longer holding the same meaning they had before, because now every face, every movement, every pause existed within a new understanding. His gaze moved across the room once, steady and deliberate, and his presence alone was enough to alter the rhythm, his men adjusting almost instantly, positions tightening, awareness sharpening, not through visible commands, but through a shared understanding built over years, and in that quiet coordination, the balance of the evening settled into his control completely. Emma Carter stood near the service station, her hands resting against a folded napkin, her posture composed, her expression neutral, but her heart still carried the echo of the choice she had made, because even now, she did not know how it would end, only that she had crossed a line she could not step back from, and when Dante's gaze found her across the room, it was not by accident, it was precise, intentional, as if he had already traced the path back to its origin. For a second, time slowed again, just as it had before, her breath catching slightly as their eyes met, and in that brief connection, there was no fear in his expression, no anger. Only recognition, a quiet acknowledgment of what she had done without words, without drawing attention, and that moment passed as quickly as it came, his gaze shifting away, his focus returning to the room, to the structure he now controlled. He moved back toward the table, his steps measured, his presence steady, and those who had been part of something unspoken felt it immediately, the change in direction, the absence of the signal they had been waiting for, the realization that the timing had broken, that the plan no longer held its shape, and without a single announcement, without a single visible disruption, the structure around him began to dissolve quietly, people adjusting, retreating, fading back into the background where they had hoped to remain unseen. Outside, Isabella remained still for a moment longer before turning away, her expression composed once again, but different now, stripped of certainty, carrying the weight of something that had not gone as intended, and as she walked down the street, her reflection in the dark windows stretched and blurred, just another figure disappearing into the city, her presence no longer tied to the man she had tried to control. Inside, Dante reached for the glass that still sat untouched on the table, lifting it slowly before setting it down again without drinking, his attention already elsewhere, because the evening was no longer about what had almost happened, it was about what came next, about the unseen connections, about the person who had stepped forward when no one else had, and without turning, without calling attention, he spoke quietly to the man nearest him, his voice low, controlled, carrying only one instruction. "Find her," he said, and across the room, Emma Carter had already begun to move, her steps quiet, her presence fading once again into the spaces between people, because she had never intended to be seen, had never asked for recognition, only acted when it mattered, and as she disappeared through the service door, leaving behind nothing but a moment no one else fully understood, the room settled into a silence that lingered just a second longer than it should have, a silence filled not with confusion, but with realization, because something had shifted that night, something small and invisible that had changed the course of everything, and in that quiet aftermath, without applause, without acknowledgment, the world moved forward carrying the weight of a truth no one could ignore, that dignity does not ask to be seen, and yet it changes everything when it chooses to act.